It's so interesting.
It's so interesting.
It's so interesting. It's interesting.
Welcome to It's So Interesting, where people talk about their work and life experience. I am George Spitzer. Today I'm talking with G.T. Harper, who writes thrillers. Okay, let's get right to it. G.T., this is your first book, one I understand you've spent a long time writing, and is based on personal experience to some degree. Tell me a little bit about the book. What is it?
Certainly. Thanks, George, for having me on your show. It's really an honor and a lot of fun to do. This is actually not my first novel, but it's the first one that I've really gotten to the point where I'm comfortable having other people read it. It came out of the a writing club that I was part of. I was being mentored by a poet, actually, in Colorado Springs. And a number of years ago, I worked on a king crab fishing boat in the Bering Sea. And the mentor that I was working with, when I told him that, thought, oh, you've got to write a novel about this. And that was really the spark for this story. I worked on it probably for 6 years, got an agent. She actually tried to sell it to the major publishing houses in New York. And we were not successful at that, unfortunately. But here I am with you, a wonderful publisher, and I'm really happy to have this book out there being read by people, hopefully everywhere.
And by the way, the book is not only a full-size, beautiful, four-color paperback, trade-back style, it's also available as an ebook on Kindle and Nook. And his website is named after the first title, Bering Storms. You mentioned king crab fishing. What is a king crab versus regular crab? All I know about crabs is I eat it in salads at a restaurant.
So king crab is actually the largest crab that you can catch. They do it up in the Bering Sea. It's considered, as everyone I'm sure has heard by now, the deadliest job in America. The show The Deadliest Catch popularized that. And actually, if you watch the very first season of The Deadliest Catch, the boat that I was on, the Billiken, which is run by Trident Seafoods, is one of the featured boats in the second half of that season. And I ended up getting on to that boat many, many years ago when one of the crew members was injured. Now, coincidentally, that same crew member is now the captain of the Billiken and was on The Deadliest Catch's first season. So anyways, king crab, big crab, difficult to catch, very dangerous to catch, and of course, as everyone knows, delicious to eat.
How big is a king crab?
They can weigh 10, I think up to 20 pounds. On the boat that I was on, which is featured in the book, we would actually have a crew of fishermen who caught them, and then we had another crew who processed them. So we would kill them, boil them, freeze them, and store them in the boat. It was a really arduous process for everybody. In 20-foot seas, I was actually on this boat for 2.5 months, and the seas never got less than about 10 feet. It was the most miserable 2 months of my life.
So you're being tossed all the time. I mean, it was never level.
You could never just lie down, read a book, enjoy anything. Cooking food was a nightmare, and actually we had a cook on board that's in the book, featured in the book, and he quit after about 2 or 3 days, hated it, and we ended up having to, as is recorded in the book, fend for ourselves in terms of eating, and it was mostly Pop-Tarts, tuna fish, things that were easy to eat. I don't think we cooked anything for 2 months.
Therefore, there are nothing like king crab on the menu.
At that point, I'd been up in the Bering Sea for about 4 months when I got on that boat, and we had eaten so much king crab, we hated it. So I don't think anybody ate one morsel of king crab while they were on that boat.
You mentioned the weight of a king crab, but it doesn't give me an image of what the size of, what's with all the arms and tentacles out, how big is the diameter of the body and with all the tentacles? Are we talking about inches or feet here?
No, you're talking feet. It's at least 3, feet long if you pulled out those tentacles. And of course, the main claws at the front of it are very powerful, like a lobster. and can, grab onto you, and you have to be completely coated in foul weather gear with clothing, undergarments. We always had warm gloves underneath the rubber gloves so that if it did grab onto you, it wasn't as painful. But it could provide some serious pressure for sure. Not a fun experience to get clipped by a king crab.
Are there people who are in the king crab fishing industry who are in it for a long time, or does everybody burn out within a year or two?
Well, yeah, there are. The captain that I was on the boat with is still working in it. The guy whose position I replaced has been in it for decades. You really can't do it much past, I think, about 50 because your body does start to break down, and it's really difficult to be on deck. I think captains who are sitting up in the deck house or the pilot house can last a lot longer. They may last into their 50s, maybe even 60. When I was working on the boat, there was probably only a couple of people in their 50s, and everybody else really was, when I was working there, was in their 20s or 30s.
Now, of course, we can't give away the whole plot of the book because then the suspense and the thrill is gone, but there's some aspects to it I think you may want to relate overall, the trajectory of the book, realizing it's fiction, of course.
In terms of
what happens?
Oh, yeah. So in the novel, it starts out on this boat that I was on, the Billiken. It's now called the Purist, and the main character is a former Coast Guard investigative service agent, and he is helping his uncles in a very difficult season for them. They've had one crew member who was injured, and he comes up to take their place. But at the same time, you've got processors on board who are not happy with the working conditions.
What do you mean by processors?
So in this, just like the boat I was on, you had a crew of people who caught the crab, and then you had another crew of people much lower, much less paid, who processed it, who killed it, cooked it, and packaged it, froze it. And so there are these two different groups on this same crab boat. We called it a catcher-processor back then. There are very few of these, if any, out there today. It's a difficult job, but one of the interesting dynamics of it is the king crab fishermen who are working out on deck are making maybe 5, possibly 10 times as much as the people working on the processing side who may be working, for minimum wage. Sometimes they get overtime, but for the most part, their pay is considerably less than the king crab fishermen. And there was this, uncomfortable conflict or anxiety between these two groups about how much they were working and about how much they were getting paid.
Do they live together? Like, is it upstairs to downstairs type situation?
The cabins are mixed. Definitely, nobody shared cabins. The processors all actually lived in one cabin. The king crab fishermen and the foreman of the processors and the engineer and captain lived in another or different cabin. So the processors probably got the worst accommodations on the boat. They're being paid the least amount of money they could possibly be paid. And sometimes they're working, 18, 20 hours. When I finally got on this boat, I was working, I actually had begged the captain of another boat to let me go over and work on the Billiken because I knew that it was really, an adventurous job. The first day I got on the boat, though, I had to work an 18-hour shift in 20-foot seas. I was seasick the entire time. I got 8 hours off where I could sleep, and then I had to go back to work for another 20-hour shift, seasick the entire time during that. And at the end of that shift, I thought to myself, I've got to call up that other captain and get him to take me back to the boat I was on formerly because it was so much easier. But so the working conditions were miserable. Like there was this conflict between who got paid more and who got paid less. And that comes out in the novel. There's these two groups that are not happy with each other for various reasons. And then there's a sort of a subplot of other things going on behind the scenes, which leads to some serious conflict as the book progresses.
When you mention 20-foot seas, many people knows what that means. I do not. So could you describe for me and many people who do not know what the phrase 20-foot seas means and what it's like, compared to most landlubbers like me, where if I go on the water, it's on a lake or on a stream, or if it's the ocean, the waves are 6 inches high. I know 20-foot seas is high, but how high? What do you mean by 20-foot seas? 20 foot from what?
Right, and it is a difficult measurement to make. I once was on a different crab boat, or actually it was a processing ship, and we were traveling between the Pribilofs and Dutch Harbor, and it started to get very stormy, and I asked the captain how high the seas were, and he responded back, how many crimes were committed in 1943. You can never really get an accurate measurement of how high these seas are, but you can look at it based on the size of the boat. Our boat was 130 feet long, probably 40 feet high, and so when the wave got up to the bottom of the pilot house, you knew you were in 25-foot seas. I was in one experience where we were up I was in the pilot house, very powerful winds, gale force. Actually, I think at some point it reached hurricane force, 70-mile-an-hour winds. And often you would get these things called rogue waves, where it's a couple of waves coming together and all of a sudden they'll double in height. And so we had this happen off our starboard bow, and we had a 45-foot wave. And I say that because the top of the wave was higher than the pilot house, and it was coming towards our starboard side. And the captain calmly, but a little bit anxiously, turned the boat as quickly as he could into it, and we were able to climb up it and over, tilting somewhat to the side. But that was probably the biggest wave I ever saw out there, and it had my heart pumping a million miles a minute, thinking that we weren't going to get turned into this in time, and it was going to hit the side of the boat and roll us, which could happen. That happened all the time up there, especially when king crab boats would put too many pots on their deck. And actually one of the scariest experiences I had was coming back off of the fishing grounds. Part of our boat actually broke down, and so the entire processing crew had to leave. I was working in that group, and we ended up taking a ride on another king crab fishing boat that had finished their season. Their crab decks were filled with crab pots, probably up to the top of the pilot house or just below it. And we got into some really, really powerful seas, and the boat was rolling. And it had a flat bottom, which is known to tip over much more easily than a V-shaped bottom boat. And fortunately we made it, or else I wouldn't be giving this interview. But at some points of that trip, I thought, we're never going to make it. The boat was tipping to 20, 25 degrees, and it seemed like we were in a very precarious situation.
My goodness. So that sounds pretty thrilling, just for the physical nature of the work and the boat and all that. But this is a thriller, a novel. It's fictional, based on some experience. Tell us a bit about what part of the book is a thriller that is not to do with the ocean. People.
Yeah, I mean the characters on the fishing boat, and especially the former investigative service agent, Coast Guard. He is there really to help protect and serve his uncles who own this boat. And he's very motivated to do that, and he's up against a number of sort of evil forces, if you will, that are trying to take over the boat eventually. But the Coast Guard also gets involved in this story. They are integral in protecting not only the fishing boat that the main character is on, but all the fishing boats in the area. And then there's a third party, a Russian trawler, who is out to actually take over a number of fishing boats. So you have all three of these elements at work that culminates in a very exciting finale with the Coast Guard, the Russian trawler, and the Russians are actually involved with the Russian mafia, and the crew on the king crab fishing boat. So these guys come together, conflict in many different ways. It plays out, I think, in an exciting finale.
In this case, does the boat, quote, roll?
It does roll, yeah. I won't tell you exactly what happens to the boat, but it's fortunate that the Coast Guard are there. I can give you that hint.
I was just curious when you mentioned about how dangerous the whole industry is, and often, you mentioned the word often, the boats roll. When a boat rolls, is it like a kayak and it comes right back up, or it rolls and stays rolled and therefore everyone's dead, or it sinks and that's the end of that boat?
Well, and it is interesting, if for those of you who watch The Deadliest Catch, the TV show, and if you look at the statistics, they don't call it The Deadliest Catch, and it's not the deadliest job for nothing. When these boats are heavily loaded especially, they do start to roll. If they go past about 30, 35 degrees, if they're hit by a very strong rogue wave, they can completely capsize, and the weight of those crab pots will keep them capsized. They won't roll back. if they didn't have the crab pots on them and they weren't top heavy because of it, it's possible that they A, wouldn't roll all the way over, or if they did, they'd roll back. But with that much top heavy weight from these crab pots, and each of these crab pots, is 7 by 3 by 2 feet. They're huge. They each weigh 700 pounds, and sometimes these fishermen will load 200 of them up on their deck, which is thousands and thousands of pounds, making the boat very unstable. So every season, almost, they're losing 1, sometimes 2 crab boats. Sometimes they go over and they find the boat. Sometimes the boat goes over and sinks immediately, and there's absolutely no trace left of them.
How many, generally, how much crew and processors are there on a boat?
On a typical crab boat, you probably have anywhere from 6 to 8 members as their crew. I mean, most of these boats are not also processing. The boat I was on was unusual in that it did both, and so it had about 14, 15 people on board.
It's lucrative. That's why I presume everyone wants to work in such a dangerous situation, physically as well as, I suppose, morally, if you want to call it that. How lucrative is it?
Well, it's interesting. For the king crab fishermen, they all get certain amounts of share based on how long they're up there. The captain usually gets twice a crew share, so he'll make twice as much as somebody working out on deck. In recent seasons, if you're looking at the Deadliest Catch, the fishermen on the top boats are making $60,000, even $65,000 for a 1 week, 2 week season. It's fairly quick, a lot of these seasons, and they're making an unbelievable amount of money. Now that they've gone actually to the quota system, they're spending more time on the fishing grounds, but making still really, really good money. So they may be working a little bit longer, but $60,000 to $70,000 for 3 or 4 weeks is not bad pay. The processors on board, on the other hand, when I was working on it, were making minimum wage. So the most they could possibly make would be maybe $5,000 for that season.
It's a question of ignorance on my side, but then why on earth would someone want to be a processor in those conditions at minimum wage?
It's definitely not a job for everybody. Most of the people that get recruited in Seattle to go work on these processing boats only do it once. They never return. I did it once. I was up there for 5 months. I would never go back. It can be a stepping stone, though, to become a fisherman. It's very difficult to enter the ranks of the fishing crews. If you go up there as a processor and work on a boat and they get to know you and they realize you're a very hard worker, you can then take over somebody's spot who has left, who had been a fisherman. I was actually offered a job while I was processing on the Billiken on another boat. I think it was the Royal Star. They had lost one of their crewmen to injury, and they offered me a job working on that, actually just for a set rate per day, which was very lucrative, and I turned it down. I said, there's just no way. I knew how dangerous the job was, and at that point I wasn't willing to take the risk of working out on deck on one of these boats.
In terms of the novel, the thriller, who is the protagonist?
The protagonist is this guy, Max Sinclair, who's a former Coast Guard Investigative Services agent. He had worked in the Coast Guard for about 6 years. As an investigative service agent for the Coast Guard is kind of like a detective. They're the police of the Coast Guard. They go out and right now they're solving mostly homeland security type issues. They may be involved in drug busts. They're doing a lot of sort of behind the scenes police work, stakeouts, investigations, things like that. And he had done that for a number of years and then ended up leaving the Coast Guard because of an experience that he had that was somewhat traumatic for him. He ended up leaving and finding other work, doing other things.
I'd like to begin to wrap up here by pointing out that no thriller, or for that matter most fictional works, are not complete with at least a female person, a love interest or some interaction, because I would presume the entire crew on these king crab fishing boats is all male. Under those conditions, it'd be tough to be a female. But is there a female in this book?
Yes, there is actually, and you're right. There are very few women who work on fishing boats in the Bering Sea. However, the Coast Guard is a very equal opportunity employer, and they hire a number of women, and I've actually worked with and met women who were pilots and worked on cutters while researching this book. I actually went down to the LA Coast Guard station and interviewed a couple of women who were pilots and had just come back from duties up in the Bering Sea. So the female interest in this novel, and is also another hero. She's probably the second most important protagonist in the novel, Veronica Jansen. She pilots one of the Coast Guard Dolphin helicopters, which flies off of a cutter while doing patrol in the Bering Sea. Coincidentally, in some respects, not too much, she was based in Seattle. Max Sinclair, our protagonist, was also based in Seattle. While they were there together, they ended up dating. And before she went up to Alaska and Max went up to Alaska, they had broken up. But here they are back on the Bering Sea. And of course, as fate would have it, they end up meeting again in much more trying circumstances than they've been in back in Seattle. So yeah, there is that love interest sort of rekindling between them as they help each other.
There is, I did read the book, there is some high wire, thrilling, tense moments of all sorts and locations. It's not just one situation. It starts off with a bang and ends with a bang as far as disaster, challenges, and so forth. I understand you'll be writing some more books. Will you be carrying this as a series? Will it be with the same protagonists? Will it be in the same locations or industries? I don't need to know exactly which ones, but what are we to expect from you for your future books?
Well, and so the next one is not going to be on the Bering Sea, but it will include Max and Veronica. All the other characters have gone on to do other things, but Max and Veronica rekindle their romance, become a very serious couple, and are engaged. And while on a sort of a leisure trip down into Mexico, they both are touring some of the parts of northern Mexico, the Copper Canyon and the Devil's Backbone, on motorcycle. While there, they get into conflicts with the Mexican authorities and then later with the Mexican northern drug cartels. So that's the focus of the second book. We're going to try and hopefully call it Sierra Rains, and it'll involve Max and Veronica having to get back to the United States after some very serious encounters with some very bad people in Mexico.
And then from there they go to some other experience. Maybe they stay together, maybe they don't. We will find out when you write your third book and your fourth in this series. But given how young you are, we're going to have a lot of books to look forward to.
Let's hope that's true.
Well, I've been talking with G.T. Harper. Thank you for being here, G.T. If you would like to contact G.T. or listen again to this show or any other show, go to ItsSoInteresting.com.
It's so interesting.
It's so interesting.
It's so interesting. It's interesting.
It's so interesting.
It's so interesting.
So interesting. It's interesting.